society needs myths. Nobody actually would say they believe this, but I think most people on some level do believe it, that, the story of what happened to the Germans is, they were a country of, that produced Mozart and Beethoven, cultured Western country, like everybody else. And then sort of they all became demons for 15 years or so. And when you say it like that, it makes no sense. And nobody would admit to believing that. But it's kind of the idea, the basic shape of things that people have in mind. After the Tucker interview, a big influx of new followers and listeners to the podcast. You had some people who, really wanted to see what this evil Nazi has to say. Those people are going to be very disappointed in this series. If they think I'm going to excuse the behavior of the National Socialists and the Third Reich, they're going to be very disappointed.
Our guest today is Darryl Cooper, host of The Martyr Made Show, a history podcast focused on understanding human beings through the lens of some of the most challenging events in world history. His new series explores World War II from the German perspective. How did ordinary German people see the events leading up to and during the war? We talk about the project, his research methodology, and the objective for the series. Enjoy.
Why don't you talk a little bit about what your new series is about?
So, as you said, it's called Enemy, and the subtitle of it is The Germans' War. And essentially, boiled down, it's going to be history of World War II from the perspective of the contemporary Germans, the Germans at the time. I think democracies, we have this in America is like this to a T, where it's really hard to get us motivated to go to war unless we think we're on a crusade, against fascism, against communism, against Islamism, whatever, terrorism. We need to feel like there's this moral evil out there that we got to go out and crush. It's the only way you can kind of animate a democratic polis to go do something like that in a sustained way. And so what that means, and what it's meant really in the 20th century, is that all wars that we've been engaged in have been just saturated with propaganda, vilification, demonization of the other side, right? And you see this in, every war we've been in, right? You see it with wars that we're not in, but people want to get us into, right? And what that means is, what it sort of naturally does is it places a set of taboos and uncomfortable topics and various things. It sets up as a sort of perimeter fence around that topic that make it so that, again, we're in America. It's not as if it's forbidden, to take a different approach at looking at historical events. But you don't have to forbid it. You just really have to make it so that the incentives to avoid it to question the prevailing narrative outweigh the incentives of doing otherwise. And that sort of just, you can keep generation after generation of historian sort of in bounds with a consensus narrative for a long time just by doing that. And, we have a good kind of tradition in this country. Maybe some people would say we've taken it too far, and there's a good argument for that, but of self-reflection, of looking back and saying, okay, yeah, in this war, we really were calling, the Native Americans like these savage, just animals that had to be wiped out or whatever. And that's how we fought that war and what happened. But we look back on it and say, maybe, there's some things we should learn from that and not ever do again things. And we do that with pretty much every single conflict that we get into over time, except for World War II. And to a certain lesser extent, we could say, except for the Civil War, but it's not as well defended as the Second World War. That is something that, take when Tucker Carlson went on Joe Rogan's podcast. And I was talking to Tucker about this, and it was really interesting because he said that of all the things that he said in that podcast, he never would have guessed the thing that just set everybody off. It was just a big firestorm for a few days on social media and stuff. Why? Because he said that it was wrong that we nuked Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Mm-hmm. And he was like, I couldn't believe that. He's like, isn't this self-evident? That you just shouldn't wipe a whole city of civilians off the map with nuclear weapons? That's not good, right? But that's how well defended the consensus narrative of World War II is. And, a big reason for that is that there's not a lot riding anymore on how people interpret the Napoleonic Wars or World War I even. You can say the Russians started it, they were conspiring with the French to draw the Germans and Austrians into. You can say the Germans were all whatever, it was a big British Empire-like scheme. Nobody cares. It's fine. World War II has a very narrow range of narrative directions you're allowed to go, and it's been that way for a long time because a lot is riding on it. We have a geopolitical power structure that is like the direct result of the Second World War and the Cold War that resulted from it. And we have a set of values that have real political cachet and have really driven policies in dramatic ways that have transformed Western countries and our relationship to the rest of the world, that are justified by the World War II story, and came out of that, as necessities, from the context of the time. And so you start to take another look at that, the way we do it, say Vietnam or the Iraq War or something. I think people sense a danger that a lot of that stuff could start to unravel. And that may be the case. That's not exactly why I'm doing the podcast. Maybe there's like a part of me that is drawn to that. It's a place that other people have sort of feared to tread, and so you want to go check it out. Especially in a time like now where you feel a little more liberated to do that. But then also, I think one of the things I said in the first episode was looking back on the rest of my podcast. The first series was about the early history of Zionism and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I really tried hard, and most people think I accomplished it pretty well, to put people in the shoes of Palestinian terrorist, a Zionist militant, a British soldier who's like assigned to, the Palestine Mandate after the First World War, and really try to understand, like, how does this look from their perspective? How does what they're doing, because what they are doing is this guy just blew up a bus full of women and kids. This guy just planted a bomb in a marketplace that is frequented by, women and kids, whatever. How is it that human beings who are no different in basic infrastructure, psychological infrastructure than you or me, that could be a course of action that made sense to them at the time and actually presented itself as an imperative at the time, and people did that. They followed me on that series, and they really did that. I've gotten, emails from like literal active duty IDF soldiers in the West Bank who told me that they listened to that podcast, and it changed the way they interact with Palestinians, like at checkpoints, say, on a daily basis. I've heard from Arabs around the Middle East and Palestinians who are in the West Bank telling me similar things, that it, made them more sympathetic to like what exactly the Jews were trying to get away from and what they were doing and why it all happened. And so that's great. I did an episode on the My Lai massacre, and I took that same approach to it. I was like, okay, these are just American boys. It's not like we selected, a group of psychopaths at the recruiting office and put them all together and said, all right, now let's go see what happens if we turn these guys loose in the jungle. These are just a cross-section of American boys who, when they got to Vietnam 3 months before the massacre occurred, they thought they were there to save these people. They were, writing home about how much joy they were taking and giving candy to the Vietnamese kids and like all these kind of things. And over the course of 3 or 4 months, that turned into a group of people who could perpetrate the My Lai massacre. And so how does that happen? How do you get from here to there without just saying these guys were never human, And so I did it with that, and people followed me. I did it with the Jonestown story, which, was like a little different challenge because it wasn't as if they were going out committing mass atrocities against other people, but still, like, in some ways it was an even bigger leap, because you really have to put yourself in the mindset of people and of a person, in the case of Jim Jones, who, countries go to war. And so you can understand how and then in a war, some of those people go off the rails and things happen. That happens all the time. You have like a situation like Jonestown where 900 people commit mass suicide in the jungle because, they're following this guy. That's like outside of anybody's, realm of experience. Even things that, you've seen.
They're killing themselves and their kids.
Their kids, yeah.
This is a different level.
Yeah. But, again, you want to look at those people in the context of their time and say, look, these were not a bunch of delusional schizophrenics who all happened to meet in the jungle. These were regular people who the pressures of the time, this rapid cultural transition that was taking place in the 1960s and 70s, the demographic transformations of the cities, the Cold War and the propaganda that was flying back and forth, regarding that, the rise of the third world, like in not just sort of geopolitics, but in the sort of collective understanding of the world that like regular people had, right? All these different things, coupled with the fact that like all of the values that the country was resting on all seemed to be sort of up for grabs and just disintegrating or thrown up in the air to see where they would fall, and all these different pressures, not to mention, of course, the Vietnam War, the civil rights protests and rioting in cities just on a scale that we it's hard for people to imagine today, but like, you go back to the 60s and like 1965 through 1969 was like George Floyd every summer. Mm-hmm. And some a little worse, some a little better, but like that's what it was like. And so you take all these pressures, and does that mean that like the whole society is going to behave in the way the Jonestown people did? No, it just means some people are going to get squeezed out at the margins. And how does that process take place? And so all of those kind of felt like a warm up for this series in a way. Because people who told me that, it was a really like noble way, like a laudable way to approach the Israeli-Palestinian story, is really to empathize with both sides and try to understand it like that. Same with these other things, even the My Lai massacre and stuff, people would say the same thing. And some of those same people, even if like they know there's a contradiction, and they can't quite explain it, they pull back from wanting to do it with the Germans in the interwar period in the Second World War. And it's because, we've got, World War II is not just a historical event. It's a symbol, in the sense that like a mythologist would use that term, it's like a symbol is an image or set of images that, over the course of our lives, sometimes from the time we're children, we're implanted with emotional triggers and predictable responses that can be triggered like later in life, that are buried so deeply that they just feel like our own will, but they're, you're trained. And this is what being brought into a society is we're teaching you. That's why we teach you all the things that are going to allow you to sort of emotionally resonate with your neighbors and your countrymen at critical times in the future, right? So that because we know that you're going to respond to a certain set of symbols in predictable ways, right? And when it is activated in the mind, it sort of creates a cascade of different emotions and affects, right? And World War II has like really become that, where, I remember, I think we were in seventh grade. Yeah, seventh grade in a history class, and they had us watch Schindler's List. And it's like, I look back on that now and I'm like,
great.
Yeah. And I'm like, man, they should have at least gotten a parental like permission slip for that or something, not to say that like that's necessarily bad. Maybe, maybe we should be showing seventh graders Schindler's List. That's a separate question, but just that like, you're doing something pretty serious when you do something like that, you're taking, this may be like slight stretch, but like you could almost say that like you're purposely traumatizing those children in order to create a certain set of responses surrounding this particular issue, And so very early on, these things start getting put into us so that when the subject comes up, there's a bunch of, those taboos. You don't even have to like necessarily consciously think about them. You just know they're there on an emotional level, that there are certain, people get worried. Like, for example, like, I knew a guy who, he loved reading, loved history, a big history library himself and everything. And he came over to my house, and, I'm working on this World War II series. And so I just got Mein Kampf and Hitler's second book and just a stack of books about the Third Reich and everything. And, he kind of had this like, whoa, like, shouldn't you be hiding those or something? And I'm like, I'm a history podcaster working on World War II, so no. And I was like, but wait a second, you've got a copy of Mein Kampf. He's like, but I keep it like in my bedroom in the closet. I don't put it on the bookshelf. And that's like pretty interesting, this is something that really in our modern world, in our secular modern world, is really like replaced the Satanic Bible in a way, as Mein Kampf. And so people are, it's almost as if it emanates like some sort of a dark magical field or aura or something that, and those things are very powerful. And they can really, they transform the way we think about the world ourselves. I mean, think about like in the course of one generation, really one generation. I mean, if you go back to like the 50s, and use today's standards, you're going to find that virtually everybody was racist. Like there were like some who were, activist types or sort of people who were like engaged left-wing progressive types, maybe not. But in general, like the things that were just taken for granted as like the way everybody kind of thought and the way things were, would be classified as racist by most people today. And over the course of one generation, we've gone from the march at Selma and, bus boycotts and just, everything else to you can go to Birmingham, Alabama today. I don't care, Jackson, Mississippi, anywhere you want in the South. And if you go stand in a 7-Eleven and say the N-word, all the white people in there are going to be like, whoa, what are you doing? Like, it's not cool. We did that in one generation. And how do we do that? Is we turned a lot of these things into symbols that have these emotional resonances. We implant them very young, and you can shape the way people see the world very quickly. And, so the question is like with World War II, I've called it a load-bearing myth, the load-bearing myth of the global order, but also the values regime that really governs Western countries in a lot of ways. And when you have something that is carrying that much weight, so that to the point where there are legal regimes in Europe and institutions like the ADL, say in the United States, that are set up that are designed almost like immune systems to like identify people who are straying outside the consensus narrative and isolating them and taking them out of the sort of cultural bloodstream if possible. That's a very powerful thing, Mm-hmm. And so, but the question is about it is not that it's a load-bearing myth. There's a lot of, I think people who they have the attitude of Nietzsche when he said, like, if there's a statue that can be pushed over, push it over, and if it can't be pushed over, great. Like, but if it can, then do it. That's an insane way to think about the world, right? I mean, that's a revolutionary, really, like way to think about the world. And, because society needs myths. People, communities, families even have their own little internal family myths, but you need those things as not only the glue to kind of hold yourselves together and identify who you are, but also you need these things that can be activated at certain times in order to orient people in the same direction and toward the same, set of goals or general behaviors. And so you need those things. The question is, what service are they really being put to? And with World War II, I think you could go back and you could say that the values regime that emerged from the consensus narrative of World War II had many positive effects. You could make the case that transformation in terms of our perception of racism was, largely, I mean, not entirely, obviously. We had our own domestic politics and things that, that were a part of that. But would that transformation have taken place when it did if we didn't have this event just in recent history that, in our version of things was essentially this racist empire that went out to conquer all the other races in the world, and like we identified that thing as like the prime evil that has to be combated? Maybe we would have had the civil rights revolution in 2060 instead of 1960. It's so you could say that, like, a lot of good came out of it in various ways. It did make us more like, it made us more, before World War II, it was just sort of, and I don't want to take this too far because, there was like the concept of limited war among European powers that, really turned it into, it was a very high cultural achievement that, kingdoms and countries could have wars without hating the enemy, and actually showing them respect even in defeat and things. And that was a great thing.
Reading even the Black Ships Before Troy recently, the retelling of the Iliad to my son, there's multiple passages, Josh and I were talking about this recently, multiple passages where you have a Trojan hero and a Greek hero fighting late into the night. It gets dark and they're like, hey, it's kind of dark. Why don't we just stop? Here's a gift. You did awesome. The other guy's like, here's another gift. See you in the morning. Here's some wine. Have fun. Rest up. Catch you later. And everybody's like, you guys are incredible.
And that stuff is
in a day,
is
like
great.
in a few hours.
Yeah.
It went from like, I want to murder you to, well done. Good game.
But World War II really transformed our perspective on war in general, and it made it so that we've been in a lot of wars since World War II, obviously, but, the Europeans haven't gone to war since then. If you would have come out of World War II and said that, 100 years from now, France, Germany, Britain, like all these, they haven't been to war since then. And it's like hard to imagine a future where they ever would, right? It's as hard to imagine it is for like us in Canada or, something like that. When you consider the history of Europe, an unbelievable change, that took place as a direct result of the Second World War. And so that's great. I would make the case, and again, I really don't like being didactic in these podcasts. I really just like telling a good story and trying to put people in the shoes of the different characters in the story. But if I do have like a perspective on it, it's that I would say that the World War II myth, for whatever good it may have done in the past, I think today is largely not helpful and destructive in many ways. I think that it's been taken to a place where, in many different ways, right? And I'll let you jump in after this because I'll ramble forever. It's cliche to say, but like every war that we've been in since 1945 has somehow, some way been against the next Hitler, This Saddam's the next Hitler, Putin's the next Hitler, et cetera, et cetera.
Elon is Hitler now.
Yeah, Elon's Hitler, and he's not doing himself a whole lot of favors on dispelling that, I guess, lately. But it's a justification for wars that, World War II is the justification for wars that even now, like, we all look back on with quite a bit of, like, at least, if not shame, then just dismay at the whole thing. I think we all kind of wish we never got into Vietnam. I think we all sort of, look at the Iraq War and realize that was probably not a good idea, but we had to. We're fighting the next Hitler. And if we didn't fight him now, we're going to have to fight him later when he's stronger and the war is going to be bigger and worse than it otherwise would have been, right? Because that's the story of World War II, the official story. And so, that's one thing. It justifies wars that, it doesn't even take 100 years for us to look back, as historians and say that was a bad idea. We know it's a bad idea like halfway through the war. But at that point, we're in it. And, that World War II story helped get us into a lot of those things. And then you take what I was talking about a second ago, the values regime that came out of World War II in terms of, the way the German the National Socialist perspective was interpreted, and sort of, they took an element of it, which was their focus on the German race. And a lot of confusion results from the fact that, not just World War II, but a lot of history in general, results from the fact that they used the word race differently back then than we do today. Back then they would talk about like the British race, the German race, the Scandinavian race, Today, like the American idea of race, which is basically based on skin pigmentation, has kind of become the way everybody talks about it. But, the Germans, their focus on the German race sort of became the seed that the anti-racist and anti-discrimination values regime that's really become dominant in the West grew out of. And again, you could say growing to a certain point that wasn't a good and necessary thing. But if it grows to the point where, you find, when you get to a point where you have European countries that can't find a reason to put a halt to their own dispossession by people from another continent in their own country. And you can trace back a lot of the reluctance to do that to their memory of World War II. You don't have to speculate about it, because all you have to do is look at the people on the other side of the argument, the people who are in favor of, the dispossession of, say, the Irish in Ireland, whatever it is. And what do they always say to people who do try to speak against it or put a stop to it? Is it takes 2 degrees and you're already at accusations of being a Nazi, right? That's sort of the bottom line thing. And if the people on the people who are interested in preventing that can't think of a ready response to say why that's not exactly like the Nazis, because then a lot of times they'll lose that argument, at least emotionally, and even to themselves, And so yeah, we're in a new world now. We're 80 years, since that war occurred, and I just think it's time to take a second look.
What do you think, if you had to state the myth in as a little pill, like what is the myth? The load-bearing myth version of the story.
That's a good question. So I think, the elevation of Winston Churchill sort of...
Careful.
Yeah. Churchill he had good qualities, right? But just in terms of the gigantic personalities in the world at the time, he was he should be, I think, remembered as a relatively minor figure, in the sense that, when you look at the photos at the later conferences with Roosevelt, Stalin, Churchill, to me, like Roosevelt and Stalin are two giants of the 20th century. These are two men who basically made the will of their nation synonymous with their own will, right? And shaped the world, that grew out of, like, nothing was the same after they came through it. Churchill, to me, is a relatively minor figure. He was somebody who was a sort of representative of British policy at the time. If you would have replaced Churchill, this was pointed out to me after I criticized him on Tucker's show, by people who, were friends of mine, but who are, they are supporters of Churchill. They said, the thing is, you can't blame him because you could have replaced him. It wouldn't have mattered. This was British imperial policy. Mm-hmm. And to me, if that is the case, then it, by kind of definition, almost makes Churchill like a more minor figure than those other guys. And yet, I think if you were to poll people and say who was, of this selection, who was the greatest man of the 20th century, I'll bet you Churchill would get more votes than Roosevelt or Stalin. Mm-hmm. And why is that? And I think it goes to your question, right? Is Churchill was sort of he was the guy in the lead up to the Second World War, when most of Europe was dead set on trying to figure out a way to avoid war. He was the one who was, saying to everybody that this problem is only going to grow. We're going to have no choice but to face it. We should face it now, or we're going to have to face it later when we're in a disadvantageous position, right? And if you have a hostage situation, and it ends in disaster, and all the hostages get shot by the hostage takers, and it's just a bloodbath. And there was a cop who was saying all along from the very beginning, we need to send the SWAT team in right now. Send them in right now. Send them in. This is going to turn to disaster. Well, when it turns to disaster, I mean, that guy sort of, whether or not he was right, or, whether it would have been any different, he wins the argument. I mean, really, and that's sort of where Churchill's at. Is he was the guy who saw it coming. He was the guy who knew that when everybody else was more focused on the geopolitics of the situation, or of how to, diplomatically maneuver, and he was the one who was saying, no, they're evil, and we have a duty to go stamp out that evil. And when the war starts, that we have to stamp that evil out completely, wipe it out completely. Is that the World War II myth essentially is that his perspective was vindicated. Or I would say that's one half of it. Mm-hmm. The other half of it is what exactly the Germans themselves were up to. This is nobody actually would say they believe this, but I think most people on some level do believe it. That the story of what happened to the Germans is they were a country of, that produced Mozart and Beethoven, cultured Western country, like everybody else. And then sort of they all became demons for 15 years or so. And then we beat them, and the ones that were left, they're actually cool again. Like we exorcised those demons or something. It really is like, when you say it like that, makes no sense. And nobody would admit to believing that. But it's kind of the idea, the basic shape of things that people have in mind. And so, if you were to ask most people today, what was the driving force in the Third Reich's foreign policy and internal domestic policy and so forth, I think some people would give some version of the answer just is racism, essentially. That they thought the Germans were the master race, and they just needed to go out and subjugate the world to the master race. That's what they were after, and that the whole National Socialist political movement from its earliest days, in the 1920s, that this was something that from the beginning was a criminal conspiracy to get control of the government so that they could go around exterminating inferior races and subjugating, inferior peoples to the master race. And if you believe that, then, the demonization of the Germans at the time and of the people who we analogize to the Germans today, well, that makes some sense. That's pretty horrible, but the truth is that's not what happened. We're at a very a time in history, the historical context of the time, the amount of change that was taking place, the amount of pressure that societies and people were under. You were seeing things pop off in unprecedented ways all the time. Look at the Soviet Union, right? I mean, nobody had ever seen anything like that. It was, you go back through the annals of history, and you're going to have a hard time finding any regime that in peacetime to its own people did what the Soviet Union was doing, just killing, starving millions of people, for not because there was a rebellion or because, they're putting down, rebellion or something, but just because the ideology demands it, And
this is for people who haven't heard this, and you're in a Humans episode. This is very below. That's later, right?
It's about the after.
It's about that's what's going on.
Yeah, it's
they're
sort
not
of
defeating an outside enemy. They're not aiming their guns externally.
Yeah,
it's an internal destruction.
Yeah, and you had
almost like religious reasons. It's insane.
The old order, the old way of organizing societies was everywhere in the West, and then later, everybody else caught up, but it was coming apart everywhere. The only places it really wasn't coming apart were places that had kind of sometimes by reason of geography, sometimes for cultural reasons, had kind of already gotten out ahead of the transition, like in England and France, for example, in the United States we're a unique case, but the rest of Europe was in a state where, the old way of organizing a society was no longer tenable. And it was a time when, it's very hard for us to really wrap our head around this, because we live in a country that, for all its political uproar and whatever else, incredibly stable set of institutions we live under. I mean, they all may be gone tomorrow, but at least like our perception of them now is that, like, people have said, like, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine like the end of American liberal capitalism, or something. And so our ideas of like what's possible and what change looks like and what our goals are in terms of, trying to act politically, they exist within the narrow confines of like the system that we have set up right now. Like, there's no, even on the right, there's nobody that they'll say, people say a lot of things, but at the end of the day, like when faced with the chaos that would occur, and the task of having to rebuild out of, from scratch, people do not want to tear down the whole system and start over. They don't want like a completely transformed, even people who say they do, like if they really had to face it, they wouldn't want that,
Mm-hmm.
And if they did, it's not possible anyway. Right. And, back then it was possible, people were living at a time where, we're a monarchy today and we might be fascist, communist, or democratic tomorrow. I mean, or something else that I come up with, anything. That's how people felt, especially after the Russian Revolution. People saw this, the most royal state in Europe probably at the time, like the, monarchy of monarchies, was overthrown by a group of, gangsters basically. And they held on to it despite the rest of the world sort of declaring them persona non grata, and trying to exclude them, but they hung around. And it gave people this idea that, like, we can do whatever you can think of, like we can make it happen right now. And when you go to a place like Germany, Germany had only been a country since 1870. It was a region before that of different Germanic states. So 1870, it becomes a country. Get up to the First World War, from that period of time up until the First World War, it's under the German Kaiser. It's the German Empire, even though it's not much of an empire. They have a colony or two here and there, but really it's a nation state, basically. Sure. But then that falls, and there's revolutions, and you get the Weimar regime, which is a parliamentarian system, kind of in the extreme. And these people are, by the time you get up to 1933 and the National Socialist Revolution, it's not as if these people are looking back on a 250-year tradition of democratic governance and thinking we got to overthrow this thing. They'd never had a democratic government until after the Versailles Treaty and the Weimar regime was set up. And pretty much everybody in German society, by the time you get to 1933, was of the opinion that this is horrible and we can't keep doing this. And, the Great Fears, one of the reasons that a lot of the industrialists and others sort of ended up throwing in with the National Socialists is everybody kind of felt like, and geography has something to do with this, but everybody kind of felt like this is going to go one of two ways. Like we're either going to go communist or we're going to go this other nationalist direction, and, and they already felt like, they were a sort of, that Versailles had made Germany kind of a colony of France and Britain, and so they didn't want anything to do with that. They certainly didn't, they were looking across the border, what was going on in Ukraine and stuff. And remember, the National Socialist Revolution is 1933. The Holodomor was 32 and 33. And so, it's at that exact time that across the border in Ukraine, millions of people are being starved to death. In Kazakhstan, another million people. And this is after 15 million people have already been butchered by this regime. And you're looking at it and saying that, like, there's probably two ways we're going to go, and one of them is to join whatever that is, and they really felt that way. And that was it was a real fear people had. And it wasn't just these industrialists didn't want to have their property expropriated. People were terrified of this for good reason. And so it gave like a certain boldness to politics that is hard to replicate today, and an intensity to politics, right? Because again, like, whether we win or lose a given election, it's always the most important election of our lifetimes and whatever. But it's like, maybe by electing the wrong president here in America in 2024, 2028, we sign our death warrant that, comes due in 2082 or something. But like, it's not gonna, result in like, we lost this political battle, and now me and my family like have to really worry that we're gonna be allowed to live, or that we're, what I mean? Like, the stakes were just immeasurably higher. And it just, you take all of the different factors that, it's not a coincidence that, if you look at the forms of government that emerged in interwar Europe, England pretty much stayed the same. France pretty much stayed the same. The closer you get to the Soviet Union, you start getting more and more and more hard right. People talk about, we don't, think of it, when we say fascist, like, I'll use it in the contemporary colloquial way, right? Not the academic way, which is confusing sometimes. But, with the exception of Spain, which was, facing a revolution that was being run from Moscow, it's like the closer to the Soviet Union you go, the more hardcore right-wing these governments get. And it's an obvious reason why, And I think that understanding the kinds of pressure that people were under at the time, even take little things, right? Like, take the fact that, in Mein Kampf, for example, the beginning of the book, Hitler's talking about his early experiences in Vienna, right? And this is before the First World War. He's a poor laborer and painter living in like a workhouse, basically a shelter, living amongst these people. And he had grown up middle class. His father, they weren't rich by any means, or they were like respectable lower middle class civil servants, right? But bourgeois. And so he was inculcated with the sort of nationalist idea, which was a bourgeois idea at the time, and basic way of looking at the world came from his class experience growing up. But then he kind of descends down into the underclass, into the real underclass. And I mean, and he got a view of something that you saw in cities all over Europe and in the United States at the time, which was, levels of poverty and mass poverty, not some poor village somewhere, but cities that are just teeming with, incredibly impoverished people. Seeing that in a society that, this is a pretty new thing to them. They didn't have any social services set up. They didn't, we're starting to put some of these things together, but this was something new, and everything was changing. And so you take like those kinds of pressures, you take the pressures of, the emergence of like the national question, which is again, another thing that to us is just a question that has been answered a long time ago. We grew up with it, but, there was like, you had like the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and, these different regions of Europe that were governed by monarchies that encompassed people who, different people, sometimes culturally or linguistically, but who had never really had like a strong sense of their own national character. They were basically the people who lived in that area.
That region.
Yeah. And that could be like, you're ruled by this monarch today, but he loses a war on the other side of Europe, and in the peace deal agrees to hand this over, and now you're his tax farm, And so the idea of like nationalism, something that's, it's pretty new. And you started to see that, where, especially in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it's just a conglomeration of nationalities that, that they had like a weak parliamentary system, that served to, I mean, like they had a parliament, the Reichsrat in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where people couldn't understand what each other were saying. I mean, like a lot of times. It wasn't as if everybody, okay, yeah, you're from Serbia or whatever, but if you're going to be in the Reichsrat, you got to learn German like the rest. No, there were people who like couldn't communicate with each other in the parliament, right? And you start to see these fissures open up. You start to see cities in different, you had like Vienna was like the central city, and it sort of was the heart of the empire in a lot of ways. But then you start to get other major cities that start to grow up in these other regions, which start to assert their own cultural identity, because it's really the cities. This is a city thing. Nationalism is a city thing. Socialism, communism, these are all things that came out of the cities. It's not as if you have like, a bunch of illiterate peasants who have been farming their entire lives, and for generations and generations, they're just focused on the next harvest, and they're there hatching schemes about Marxist revolution, or, that's just, it never worked that way. It's just something that came out of like literate cities. People could be propagandized too. They were sort of deracinated and pulled out of their village life and brought into the city where they're a little more anonymous, and their social world is an upheaval, in a lot of ways, makes them susceptible to ideology, let's say. And so these things come out of the cities, and you start to get cities that form up in different parts of these empires, and you start to just get this pull, this fragmentation, right? And so if you look at like the United States today, and and observe that we have like regional differences. And sometimes those become like political conflicts, like even if they're not necessarily discussed in that way, like on the news, like a lot of times you look at it and that's kind of what's going on. You look at the Biden administration's response to North Carolina and the floods, and you look at, what's going on in California after the fires, and there's just a different level of concern, and why? I mean, you can maybe say different reasons, but I mean, I think that pretty obviously to anyone is that different people live in those places, and they have a different relationship to that regime, right? Well, imagine if if those sort of differences started getting to the point where, from time to time you were getting like acts of terrorism and separatist movements and secessionist movements all over that were very serious, and that had, and that were being used by other countries as like diplomatic levers against us, right? Those are the kind of things that were going on. And so, people lived in this world that really had been, like the game board had been thrown up in the air after the First World War. And the interwar period was a long struggle of where those pieces were going to land. And, when you want to talk about another thing that is, again, hard for us to really imagine. Even our like combat veterans can't really imagine this because it's so different. But like, you had an entire generation of men in Europe who most formative years of their lives were spent in the trenches. I mean, these people had, it's one thing to, and I don't mean to denigrate anything that any combat veteran does, but like, it's a different thing when you go to Iraq or Afghanistan, and you have night vision and the other side doesn't, and you can call in airstrikes and the other side has no air defense, and you're trained in tactics, and it's hard and it's heroic for sure, but it's different than being in the trenches. And like, every single person had seen dead bodies throughout their early 20s. They had seen their friends be killed. They had seen, they'd been in an environment where they saw people who were their social betters, the officers who had come from like a different social class back then. It's like not so much that way now, but back then, if you were an officer, you're from a different social class. When you see one of those guys cower or break down under the stress of battle, and you see that enough times, there's a leveling effect, and so people came out of the trenches with that idea. And so when you get up to the, when you go through the interwar period and the lead up to the Second World War, it's not only that everything was up for grabs. It's not only that the stakes were immensely higher, than what we can really relate to. It's also that this was being lived out by a group of people who had just had a lesson, like the primary formative lesson of their young adult lives was that, you can just decide to throw millions of lives away for reasons that to this day, we are still kind of like, I don't really know, like what was the reason for World War? Still debates about it, And so at the time, people are coming through that experience and they have different expectations of how the world works, of what's appropriate in terms of the relations of peoples, of what can be accomplished through force of just pure violence, and I think that trying to get into the heads of people who are from a very different world than our own, but who are formed from the same basic stuff. I mean, that's the most interesting thing about history to me.
Yeah. Looking forward, I mean, you talked about how the load-bearing myths in many ways act as glue to keep different families, groups together. Are there any obvious downsides, or as the World War II myth potentially starts to age out, any potential downsides of negative places we could go or positive places moving forward?
I mean, yeah, we could give up the things that were like the positive things that did come out of that conflict. We could lose that sense of that sense that things that were for most of human history like acceptable to do to other people if they were your enemy, that today we feel, at the very least, we feel the need to sort of talk our way around. We have to come up with like a moral justification for almost any war that we get into now. And it may be that they're fig leaves or whatever, but like the fact that we feel the necessity to do it means something, because, the tension between the rhetoric and the reality, like that space that opens up between there is where transformation does occur, so look, I think here's the thing, is it depends on who you're asking, right? If you ask like an Israeli Jew, is there any danger to the world sort of not forgetting about this, this event, but of it becoming like the Napoleonic Wars and like Caesar's Gallic Wars and the Mongol and whatever else? It's just another historical event. We can talk about it like we talk about anything else. They're probably going to have some, pretty strong and from their own perspective, well-founded concerns about what might happen after that, But if you ask, the Germans, say, people who have lived under a kind of regime of psychological terror for the last 80 years, because, that's resulted in like a level of national self-hatred that, even the bluest haired American can't really wrap their heads around, that it could be positive for somebody like them. It's hard to say, it really is hard to say. Like I wouldn't, Chesterton's fence is a reason we love that analogy. If something is there, you should probably at least know why it was put up and what it's protecting or holding back before you go tearing it down. And so, yeah, I wouldn't want to be too confident in a prediction of like where it might go.
I will say, I mean, at least, maybe this is where we can move to method. I think one of the concerns would be that there's people who want to take the fences down to revel in the actual horror that was perpetrated to other people on either side, that it's like, yay, it's okay to just whatever, I don't know, identify with the Nazis or something absurd like that. But that's obviously what the project is not aiming to do.
No, it's one thing I wrote. Sorry to interject,
no, exactly.
I got, obviously, after the Tucker interview, a big influx of new followers and listeners to the podcast who were coming at it from all different places. You had some people who, really wanted to see what this evil Nazi has to say so that I can condemn it. Other people are like, oh, I want to hear more about this, because that's, they are on that side of things.
Sure.
Those people are going to be very disappointed in this series. If they think I'm going to excuse the behavior of the National Socialists and the Third Reich, they're going to be very disappointed. I mean, there's you can understand how people went from being innocent, 7-year-old children who just didn't even know that people could do things like that to each other, with their whole lives ahead of them, to being, people at concentration camps shoving people into ovens. You can understand the pressures that created a situation like that, the steps that led to something like that, without ever, having to deny the outcome that actually occurred. Like there's absolute, look, when the Third Reich went east, and really, I mean, this started, people like to say that it started with Barbarossa when they invaded the Soviet Union. And one of the excuses or explanations that people use is that, the Soviet Union, just based on what everybody had seen, and they would say this is sort of backed up by what happened at the end of the war, after the Soviets invaded Germany and everything, that they were now fighting an enemy that was just so over the top and so dangerous that, like, they're facing basically national extinction unless they win this war. And so all bets are off, and they have to fight this as a complete and total war of annihilation. Mm-hmm. But that ignores the fact that when they went into Poland in 1939, they weren't exactly fighting a war of extermination, but they were slaughtering innocent people. They were rounding. You have German generals in like October, November 1939, so 2 months into the war, who were writing in their diaries complaining. They didn't like what was going on, but they were talking about, in some places, they're hearing about Jews being rounded up in barns and shot. 2 months into the war. Okay, so this isn't like, as you get later into the war, and you think about the situation that the Third Reich was in, now you're in a war with the Soviet Union. It's a much closer run thing than you expected it to be. This is a regime that is more people than you. It's bigger, more industrial capacity, and all these other things. And you kind of were hoping to score a knockout blow. But now you've got this regime that has killed 15, 20 million of its own people in the last 20 years, that is now taking steps toward your homeland. Meanwhile, the British, and then eventually the Americans, they're flattening your cities with firebombs, right? And you haven't even really attacked the British in a while, because you can't get there, and you kind of lost the Battle of Britain in the air. And so you've been focused on the East, and Britain's still over here just firebombing your cities, killing tens of thousands of people in one night, right? And this is what's going on. And
soldiers, right?
Oh yeah, of course. And so you say, like, people who are in a situation like that, like, that's the kind of pressure that leads to serious, leads people to go off the rails, right? Mm-hmm. And that's all true. But you have to, again, take it back to the beginning of the war and just the espoused attitudes of Hitler and the rest of the Third Reich officials before the war to see that, did the pressure of the environment contribute to the way they behaved? Sure. But that from the moment they stepped into Poland, they were behaving in ways that there is no excuse for. And even they, so to a certain extent, they themselves knew that, because they didn't behave that way in the West. They didn't treat the French like that. They didn't treat the Belgians or anybody else in the West like that. They treated the people in the East like that. And, like I said, the people who think I'm going to excuse the behavior of the Third Reich are going to be disappointed.
So for a series like this, especially World War II, there is an endless ocean of literature. If you go into a used bookstore or anywhere, the World War II literature is seemingly infinite. So when you come to a series like this, how do you start? Like, what's your process? How do you map out how you're going to dive into this content?
Yeah. So it's been a different challenge, because when I did the Israel-Palestine series, which only goes up to 1948, the foundation of the state, political Zionism is like a movement that was more than just some guy writing, in his diary about it or something. Emerged in like the 1880s, and the state was founded in 1948. The cast of characters, like really relevant characters, relatively small, to the point where, the things that have been written on it are relatively limited, at least in English, are relatively limited, to the point where by the time I got to the end of that series, there might have been I'm sure there have been some things that have been written since then. I'm pretty sure I read every book about that topic. I mean, I read over 80 books just on that topic up to 1948, right? The formation of the state and sort of the early history of Zionism. And it got to the point where I was hunting down just obscure manuscripts and going like to different places, to different archives, because they had diaries I could read and stuff. And I was really having to hunt down just, different things. World War II is the opposite problem. I mean, there are just millions and millions of pages written. You're never going to read them all. You're never going to be, and so, by picking and choosing what you are going to read and how you are, it's going to determine how you present the thing, and it's going to determine the shape of your story, right? And so what I did at first was what I do with all my other series, is I take like the sort of the most mainstream survey books, of like, here's what happened, all in one volume kind of thing. And you read a bunch of those until you get to the point where, the timeline, the characters, and those kind of things are all sort of cemented in your brain. And hopefully, by the time you keep reading through the survey books, you get to a point where there's certain questions that start emerging in your mind about like, well, like, here's something, it seems like, I just don't quite understand how this came together, or I don't understand what the motivation of this person was, or, why these people behaved in, this way, but these other, whatever it is, you start to get these questions that start to become almost like minor obsessions. And then once you have those, you go pursue those in the specialist works, and sometimes that drags you really far off of like for the Jonestown series, I was reading not just books about cults in general and cult psychology, but I was reading just like psychological books about about people who about the long-term effects of or the psychological effects of long-term use of amphetamines, because that was a big part of the Jim Jones story. Like reading things that are pretty far off the beaten path to try to get your arms around these questions that you have about these people.
Yeah, if someone sees you reading that book, they can't imagine. They couldn't guess.
Yeah, right.
Searching for a jump.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so, I did that with this series. I read all the big Hitler biographies, the biographies of several other Third Reich officials, and then just several of the sort of, Ian Kershaw sort of like official histories of the Second World War. And then from there, I went and I started looking for, like one of the things I'm not trying to do with this series, I'm not trying to provide the German perspective as like a corrective to the story that's out there. Like in the sense of like, like a Mythbusters kind of thing or something like that. I'm not interested in doing that. What I'm interested in is there's a bunch of people who culturally are extremely familiar to us. These are Christians, Europeans, people who, 5.9 million Germans emigrated to the United States. We have a massive German legacy population here, people, this is a country whose monarch during the imperial period was related to all the other, monarchs in Europe for the most part. So this is like a very culturally familiar people behaving in a way en masse that is very, very unfamiliar to us. And our way of trying to understand that for so long has just been to sort of caricaturize them into demons, that these are demons, basically. You can't understand them according to any logic or rules that are going to make sense in your mind, because you're really not the same.
They became monsters randomly.
Yeah. And, that's the part that I think, it's, that's a way of thinking that can be exported to other contexts and has been over the years, and it's one that, I think, look, I think that a lot of people might fear that if we give that up, like if we move past that, a place where we're able to think of these people as monsters, that it'll sap our will for conflicts that maybe do need to occur, things that we do need to do, when one really does show up, that we're not going to be able to deal with that because we're so busy in our own heads doubting ourselves and wondering if maybe we're the bad guys and what have we done to contribute to this and everything else. And I suppose that is a risk, maybe. But for me, it's a risk I'm willing to take. It's in the sense that war is this could sound like really insensitive to people who have suffered through war, but I really don't mean it in the worst way that you could interpret it. But wars happen and things are destroyed and people are killed, and then things are rebuilt and populations are, restored, replaced. That doesn't help the people who are directly affected. Anything I'm not downplaying that, but if you were to say, France lost the Napoleonic Wars, and you look at France 100 years later, or 100 years later from that, it's fine. You know what I mean? It's part of their history that's sort of worked into it, and doesn't help the mother who lost her son on the battlefield. But it's, but the moral corruption that war and the war mind really demands of us, that can be long lasting. That can twist your soul in a way that you can't quite recover from even over long periods of time, and so to me, if there's a real physical danger, a danger that there's going to be a future threat that, maybe we're too hesitant to stand up to because we're always trying to see things from the other side and understand and empathize with the other, that may be a risk. But I just think that the risk of continuing to think in that way is much greater and on a much deeper level. You know what I mean? If we have to lose a war because we're too hesitant to do something, some future time, again, our people will be fine. You know what I mean? But if we become something other than what we are, in order to give us the certainty we need to be able to go and do things to people that, according to our daily life values are the worst crimes, that a human can commit, then that's something we might not be able to get back, So,
yeah, I don't know if we said this in the last episode, but my wife and I were watching a TV series last year at some point about, I guess it was a book that was turned into an Amazon series or Apple series called "We Were the Lucky Ones," about this family, Jewish, I think they were Polish, and how basically it's the series and the book, but the series it's 8 episodes. It spans 10 years or 6 years, and at the beginning, the war starts, Polish invasion, and invasion of Poland, and then the family gets fractured, and you kind of follow through the 8 episodes. This guy goes to Brazil. This guy, his wife escaped this direction, and then it's a real story and real family. And at the end of the series, they all get reunited, which is great. They suffer a lot. It's great. It's good. That part is great. But as we were watching the show, it struck us, and we have sort of no horse in the fight. We're neither Jewish nor German nor Polish. We're just observing a story as it was presented to us. And it was just very interesting, very apparent how every single time that a German was on screen, Didn't matter if he was the butcher, didn't matter if he was the neighbor, it didn't matter if he was the guard, it didn't matter if he was the lady of church. They were portrayed as psychopathic, bloodthirsty villains for you to hate, like viscerally just hate. There's this scene where one of the main characters, she's I don't remember exactly. I think it's later in the timeline. She essentially takes a job as a shopkeeper for a local village, and she's essentially keeps saying the fact that she's Jewish, and then she's serving a lot of German or German adjacent customers, women, and I think she sells handbags and scarves and stuff like that. And she checks them out. You know, she's like the attendant, and there's this line of German women, long line of women waiting to check out, and one has a handbag and brings it to her, and the clandestine Jewish shopkeeper is like, you know, checking her out, and the German lady, she could be a mom, she could be across the street just with her kids at a coffee shop. She says something like, you know, please make sure to wrap it because I don't want any of that nasty ash landing on my new bag. She turns around to all the other women in line, and they all laugh in this like evil way. And that was the scene where I was like, there's something just bizarre about this.
Yeah.
Of course it's bad that people were getting burned, and that's awful, terrible. But then the immediate like switch, it's very weird and bad and weird in different ways, like turning them all into demons. But especially, so point A. B, it's 2024 when we were watching this. We have sort of no more dog in the fight. And yet I am continually made to think of those people, of those women, of moms and dads and pastors and priests and shopkeepers as just demons, as monsters.
And the thing is, like, unless you're sort of thinking about these things as you were, like most people would just be passively consuming that show, right? They wouldn't be even really kind of placing it in like the context you're talking about. They're just accepting it, just, you know, having it sort of, just taking it as a viewer.
Catechize them, right?
And they wouldn't even understand that, like, if you were to tell them that that was a piece of propaganda or even a piece of hate propaganda, which is really what it is, they wouldn't know what you're talking about, and they'd fight you on it. You show them like The Eternal Jew or something else that came out of, like, you know, Goebbels' propaganda ministry, that's propaganda. They know what that is. Because you see something like that and people are being propagandized without even knowing that what they're viewing is propaganda. And, you know, it's a kind of fantasy world where that, you know, people of all times in any place, that's not how people behave. You know, even the people, the societies who do the worst things, the countries or the militaries do the worst things. Like, you know, you don't have your average people just behaving in completely antisocial, anti-human ways like that on a regular basis. You know, if anything, like, these things are done because from their perspective, this is viewed as a crisis, you know, an existential crisis, or it's viewed as, you know, just revenge for something that, you know, that has been done to us. Right. And, but, you know, yeah, I think, have you ever seen that documentary? It came out right after the war called Hitler Lives. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they got Dr. Seuss was one of the creators of it, but the federal government, the U.S. federal government, had it made. And you watch it, and it's what you're talking about, just, I mean, with all of the unsubtlety of, like, you know, something from 70 years ago, 80 years ago. I mean, it is, you could call it The Eternal German, and it would fit perfectly. It's just a straight up piece of hate propaganda. These are barbarians who have plunged the world into war multiple times, and they have to be kept down and not allowed to do this again, or, you know, I mean, and it's all of them, you know. And yeah, I mean, I think that when you see something like the unsubtle version, like Hitler Lives, people see that and they're like, oh, okay, I can see where this kind of thinking, you know, could go a very dark way.
Mm-hmm.
But then they see it in like the show you're talking about, that sort of now we're more subtle and things are more well packaged, and we're more, people are so used to being propagandized to at this point that things really have to be sort of concealed and hidden a lot more than they used to. But yeah, I'd say, I think that the thing is with the case of World War II, it's like the one topic, and the Germans specifically, it's like the one topic in our culture that virtually everybody is saturated with more or less, but some hate propaganda about these people from their early childhood on. And there's no other people that you could really even get away with doing that of, but with the Germans, it's almost a mandatory thing that you have to view it in that way. And it's, and it's almost because like they sort of have taken on the role in, again, our modern secular world, like Hitler's the devil, the German people were his legion of demons, Auschwitz is his kingdom in hell, and that's the devil we believe in. People don't believe in, you can desecrate the Last Supper on, the Paris Olympics opening ceremony. Nobody cares, right? I mean, people care, but if they would have gone up there and like started flashing swastikas, you find out what caring really looked like. We'd probably be invading France, Mm-hmm. And so that's, it sort of serves as the counter reference point for like who we are,
mm-hmm.
at least who.
Not them. Whatever they are, we're not them.
Yeah. And then when you take it one step further, and you see this all the time in the rhetoric from people on the left, but just liberals and progressives really throughout the years have kind of seen it this way, that, that there's this march of history that, you had to fight the Confederates to end slavery. You had to fight the Germans who tried to exterminate all the Jews. You had to fight Bull Connor and the segregationists during the Civil Rights era. And now we've got to fight you. And like, it's all one thing. Mm-hmm. And it's one long historical battle that they're on the right side of. And you, if you want to have a sane immigration system, or if whatever, any range of, the things you'll get called a Nazi for these days are pretty broad. But that's, but that's the idea, is that there's this, it
immediately places you on the side of Hitler and on the side of some people if you oppose the alternative.
And and it's a myth in that sense, like in the Sorelian sense, right? Where it's something that is designed to orient people and to give them impetus for action in a given direction, and that's what that does. It's how these people, the liberal left kind of orients itself in the world, is that they're on the right side of that generations long fight between, the forces of light and the forces of darkness, say.
But and that heuristic itself comes out of the World War II post-war consensus, doesn't it? Like they're reading back history as that continuum since, because they don't go back to they're not going back to the Napoleonic War. They don't even go back to the French Revolution necessarily, although I guess they do co-op like the keep.
I think you had some strains of that, like in the liberal, progressive sides of things, like really after the Civil War on up. You had people who, in Europe, it took a different form, obviously, because they didn't have the racism issue, but they did have like just the remnants of the feudal order and aristocratic privileges and class inequality that sort of, became the thing that that the liberals and progressives kind of rallied against, but still seeing it as like a, we are emerging out of the dark ages.
Like post-enlightenment
thinking. And so there's some of that. But I think you're right that World War II really kind of crystallized the whole narrative into something that, the fact that you can convince like an average street protester at a university campus that they're basically fighting the same battle that our grandfathers on Normandy Beach were fighting, and that their grandfathers were fighting at Antietam, and really see themselves in that. That's an effective myth. That's a powerful myth. There's a reason that those people, for most of the last century or so, have been winning. And it's because like that is a very powerful myth. And the other side has sort of lacked has sort of lacked a similarly unifying and energizing myth of their own, right? It's just a series of reactionary sort of counters to whatever the other side is doing, and have a lot of trouble really kind of asserting their own view of the world. You see this, I mean, this is the complaint that, so many just conservatives or people on the right have of the Republican Party or just conservative parties in Europe today, is that, they basically accept all the premises of the other side,
right,
and really spend most of their time trying to deflect the accusations of deviating from that premise. Like, that's what most of their energy is spent doing, and it really is. And what that does, I mean, what it means is that every time they take power, they get some more of their agenda accomplished. And every time you take power, you spend time trying to prove that you're not a bad guy, you know? And, yeah, I mean, the difficulty you run into with a lot of these things is, at the core of any myth is it's both it poses and answers the question of who we are. Like, who are we? Like, what does that even mean? What are the boundaries of us? Who is we and who is not we? And what does it mean to be one of us, right? And so when you do something like that, like, you're, by definition, you're creating boundaries. That's exclusionary. Mm-hmm. And if you live in a society that, like ours today, is already, I mean, it's so just divided along, I mean, every axis you can think of: ethnic, racial, linguistic, religious, cultural. I mean, just everything. To say, like, okay, so, like, what is it that actually makes us us, or who even is us? It's a very hard question for most people to answer in a way that doesn't immediately sort of cast out or exclude people who might live, like, on the next block, and that's a very, very tough thing to do. I mean, if you look at, like, one of the things Hitler talks about early in Mein Kampf, he's describing his early years and sort of his formative, how I became who I am and got my politics. And one of the things he says is very interesting is he is in Vienna, seeing, like, just sort of the rabble, the outcasts of, Viennese society, people who fell out the bottom, living in the poorhouse with him and stuff. And a lot of these people are poor specimens of human beings, like, for every sort of noble proletarian, doing his thing against all odds or whatever, I mean, you've got 10 drunks who beat their wives and their kids and are just dissolute, terrible people. And seeing this, like, he started to fall into despair about just, like, the state of the German race, He's looking, he's like, are these my people? Like, this is, I've been a nationalist since I was a kid. My teachers taught me to be one and everything, but this is, like, these are my people? And for him, the Jewish question was, like, his way around that conundrum. And he says this himself, like, directly. He says it was the key that unlocked everything else for him and allowed everything else to take shape. Because what it did was allowed him to say, oh no, these people, yes, they're in a terrible, sorry state, but they're victims. And victims have victimizers. And let's look around, like, who are their victimizers? And, at the time, I mean, he wasn't the one, obviously, who invented anti-Semitism. That was a whole big anti-Semitic press. The mayor of Vienna for a long time, Luger, was, he was one of the leaders of, like, I mean, there was, anti-Semite was not a word that, like, Jews and people who didn't like anti-Semitism called people. They called themselves that. It was a movement, Mm-hmm. And so all this infrastructure was already in place. These ideas were already there to explain to him that, yes, these people are victims, and here's who's victimizing them. And that, this is always hard, because, like, this is always a danger. And you see it even in our modern society, right? That his contempt and hatred for those people is what allowed him to love his own people. And without that, he probably would not have been able to achieve that. And that happens more often than not. and because it's, it allows you to overcome differences that you have with, your own people, that otherwise would be maybe deal breakers for you in some way, or would at least demoralize you and not want, make it so we're not super energized about the collective and where it was going. And so, I mean, look, you see it's hard to suss out what's just trolling and whatever on the internet from, people say a lot of things to get rises out of people and stuff. But I mean, you did see a few weeks ago, or I guess maybe a couple months ago, I can't remember, but when Vivek Ramaswamy came out and they're having the H-1B visa debate, and he came out just in favor of the sort of doctrinaire meritocracy kind of idea, we want the best, and et cetera, et cetera. And people criticized him, and there's a lot of good criticisms. I agree with a lot of criticisms of him, of his position, but a huge portion of that, even among people who, maybe they're not on TV or something, but they're not insignificant, right-wing figures who are just talking about you're not an American. You shouldn't be talking about this. And the reason for that is that he's got Indian blood in his veins. And that kind of thing, I'm not down with that. This is a guy who could be my neighbor, and he lives here and he was born here. And so you got to figure out a way to love the society that you have. And if you start thinking about, you start placing all these conditions on it, that that your concern for this society, or your willingness to to really, in an emotional way, be a part of it, is contingent on
hurting another.
Yeah. Then again, it's always tempting, because a common enemy always unites people, and and because to say who is us, you have to say who is them. But when you start doing that, again, in a very diverse society like our own, it's just, it is dangerous, I've seen people ask the question, why is it? And I don't have maybe a great answer to it. But it has to do with what we're talking about now. It's why is it that there's no white identitarian groups, there's no Aryan Brotherhood or whatever else, that they're just totally positive. It's all just how great Europeans are, and all the great European culture that we've created, and celebrate our ancestors and our heritage and all that. It's you go to just pretty much any message board, any organization, anything you find, where that's their sort of perspective on the world, and it's 1% that and 99% just vitriol toward other people.
Right.
And and that's the case with, identitarian movements all across the board. It's not just, white identitarian. It's just, and the reason is because that's the shortest, the shortest path between 2 points. It's the easiest, it's the path of least resistance to actually create, and sustain a collective.
Yeah, nothing brings two people together faster than hatred for a third. In that way.
Yeah, that's very Girardian, actually.
Yeah, but in a sense, and that's, I think, you said it well. And it's certainly when I put my finger out in the wind, as far as the dangers of even the vibe shift victory that we've seen recently. It's we've been so fractured for so long, not just the particular state where we're in, or the particular region, or the U.S., but just the West, that there's shortcuts to reuniting.
Yeah.
To feeling again like one people that emerge from and lead to really dark places. Just as we want to react against darkness, like trancing kids and all that stuff, but you can really easily react away from something that's evil, or against something that's evil, into in shortcut, instead of doing the work, the labor that takes generations to say, okay, now we're from Wisconsin, or now we're from Idaho, and this is our people, these are our mountains, these are our rivers. So our collective identity is as this group of guys, as this group chat, as this company, as this, is we hate those people, and that's dark. Like that's dark, regardless of whether you're right wing, left wing. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, and it can function even within the context of an idea that in itself is not evil. It's not bad. I mean, Hitler's idea of Germanism was, again, you have to go back to the time and remember that they were in a time where everything was kind of up for grabs. All the borders of Europe had just been redrawn in 1918, 1919. I mean, you had countries in existence that had never existed before, peoples who were now nations that, had never been nations before, all these things going on. And you had this idea of okay, you have states, you have kingdoms, but then within all these things, you have nationalities. And one of those nationalities is Germans. And, the German people mostly live in Germany, but they live in Austria, they live in Czechoslovakia, they live in Poland, all these other places. They sort of spread out because the borders of Europe are fairly arbitrary. They're based on who won what war at this point, blah, blah, blah. And the important thing is not these borders. The important thing is the people, the peoples. And the German people are a thing. And the German people should be in a nation together. And that's how it should be. There's nothing evil about that. It's a totally reasonable, especially in the context of their time, totally, it was as reasonable as any other idea that was on offer at the time, right? Because why wouldn't that be the thing that mattered? And why should the borders of a state matter more than the borders of where these people, this nation of people live, Totally fine. But then again, within the context of an idea that's not bad at all, the question becomes how do you actually unite and motivate a people to take the actions required to bring that reality into existence? And, look, basically we found two ways to do it, in history, I think. One is a common enemy, and the other one is extremely rare. And it's like when you see the founding of the Christian church or something where, it's not based on the opposition to a common enemy. It's based on, a positive idea of bringing people together for something new. But that's extremely difficult and extremely rare. And when movements do start out that way, or resembling that at least, very often, as soon as the charismatic leader goes away, or even while he's still around, it takes the wrong turn, because you hit a point where now you're starting to get dissent within the ranks. And you say, what do I got to do to keep this coalition together, keep these people together? And, there's this guy over here who none of us really like all that much anyway. And, it's very tempting.
Right. And that could be the danger, especially even for the new right, where the new right broadly could have been defined as we're anti-woke, we're anti-trans, we're anti-this, But great, there's sport to be done. But let's just say we won. What cathedral are you going to build next? Okay, sure, that enemy dealt with. What's the next multi-generational project you're embarking on? And a lot of these guys don't have answers to that question. They don't think in those terms. It's much easier, I could say, it's to say we're just against the vaccine, or we're just against the censorship, things like that. I wanted to go back to method. It's in a good way. We took a long rabbit trail out of it. So you read, you start with the surveys, then you start find these questions that aren't answered. Go to the specialist books. Are you taking notes? Are you writing essays? Are you I write essays. You catalog the questions and the research that you're doing.
Yeah, I write a lot. Writing is how I think, I guess, if that makes any sense. I'll if I just sit at a table and try to think about a topic,
sure,
then I'll just kind of spin around on the first, the first sort of idea that comes into my head until I get distracted or get bored or something. But if I write that idea down and then just kind of keep writing, then all of these thoughts that I never had before, but clearly were locked up in there somewhere, come tumbling out. It's like the way I think through things. And a lot of times I have to write things out just to realize that I'm going down the wrong path, and I would say I probably write and not notes. This is like just written prose. I probably write maybe 150, 200 pages for every hour of material I make. And a lot of it is, it's almost like journaling in a way, you know, but, you know, these are like the way that I pick, that I choose the questions to focus on is, you know, it's not that like, okay, there's a sort of like a hole in the narrative of this book and I need to go to some other book that's going to fill that hole. It's more like over the course of this story, like there are just certain things like, you know, the Jonestown one's a perfect example. Like the thing that like you go through that story and everybody knows that a bunch of crazy people went out in the jungle, drank Kool-Aid and committed suicide. But, you know, as I'm going through it, I'm like, man, you have this white preacher with a 75% black congregation. That's interesting. And, you know, everybody who was in that congregation who was over like 40 years old wasn't born in California where they came from. They were all born in the Jim Crow South and migrated to California. That's interesting. Mm-hmm. Like what's going on there? Like what's the dynamic there? Why would those people be drawn into a movement like this? And, you know, or, you know, you start to think about just the psychological dynamic of a person like Jim Jones. You know, what does it take to create a personality that could do something like that could captivate that many people and be this person who, you know, to people who it didn't work on, it was just repulsive to them. But to the people it worked on, man, it worked, you know, and like, what is going on there? And, you know, you don't have to sort of go looking for these questions. Just as you're reading through the surveys, they'll just start forcing themselves on you. And it's like, you're okay, done with that book. And I pick up another book. And now I'm like kind of reading this book, I noticed, to like look for insight into that question. And you start to figure out what those are. And then once you figure out what those are, then, you know, you've got a direction for your podcast. Because there are a lot, you know, there are a lot of history podcasts out there. And I don't discount the role of luck. I mean, there's a huge amount of luck involved in mine being as successful as it is. There's a lot of great ones out there nobody's ever heard of. But I will say that the vast majority of history podcasts, what they're basically doing is taking those survey books and telling them to you summarizing them to you in like a more or less engaging manner. The good ones are, you know, good and the bad ones are not so good. Mm-hmm. But that's basically what they're almost all doing. To me, that's just the scaffolding on which the real podcast is kind of hanging. You know, the Jim Jones story is fascinating. The story of his church, you know, is totally fascinating, but it was a lens through which to view like that entire period of revolutionary transformation in the US and really like in the Western world in general, you know, the 60s and 70s and kind of what society as a whole was going through because it was reflected in these people and in their trajectory. And so really trying to get into those things and not minding, you know, going on like every once in a while I'll get a review of somebody who says like, you know, it's decent delivery and whatever, but man, he goes on like 45-minute tangents that have nothing to do with the story. And all of the people who stick around who are still Martyr Made listeners are like, yeah, that's really what we're here for.
Chat image.
Yeah, it's like, we know there was a war that started in 1939 and there were these battles and da-da-da-da-da. We know that. Like, you know, that's what they're there for. Sure. And, you know, it's a gratifying way to do it, you know, because really it just allows me to do, you know, every day for a job what I would be doing in my spare time and bothering my friends with anyway, you know. So
how much, when you sit down to record, how much are you writing out for that episode versus kind of going impromptu?
So usually like the introduction and the outro I'll write out. And then if there are certain points that are sort of like emotional inflection points in the story or certain things that, you know, I need to be, you know, if you're talking about victims of something or whatever, where you need to be particularly aware of like how you're wording things, you know, I'll write those out. And then of course, quotations I'll write out, but otherwise it's connected through just a scaffolding of more or less detailed notes, depending on, you know, if it's a,
so you have printed out, you're scrolling and recording as you go through.
Yeah. Because it's, I mean, usually you're talking about, if I'm doing a 4 or 5 hour episode, I've probably got 200 pages, of notes and stuff. So, but sometimes, I'll just sort of like lose my place in the notes because I end up going off on a tangent on my own, and I have to go back and, bring it back to the story. But, yeah, that's basically how I do it. I mean, and the way I pick topics in general, well, this one kind of got picked for me because of the Tucker appearance. I had been like, one of the things I'll do is like right now, as I'm working on this World War II series, it's probably going to take me 2 years to finish. I mean, it's probably going to be like 8 episodes. And so, it's going to be a while before they're all done. But even now I'm doing background reading for the next series. And I've been reading like the background reading for World War II for about, I've been like everybody who's interested in history. I've read about World War II forever, but really like studying it in a structured way for like the last maybe year and a half, 2 years. I would do that in the evenings and the mornings, and then work on the project at hand during the day. And so, I'll be doing that. And the way that I choose topics usually is just that, I'll find that, and this happens every single time, it's going to happen with this series, is I'll get about 2/3 of the way through whatever I'm working on, and I'll find myself having to like physically restrain myself from putting this book down and going reading about this other thing, because like, and often it emerges out of the thing that I'm just working on, or or that I had worked on in the past, but it'll get to the point where like, man, I have to really discipline myself to finish this series because I really want to go work on that now. And yeah, that's just how I, and it's good because like, my listeners don't have a whole lot of expectations in terms of, I mean, look, they loved an episode I did about Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. They like my Easter episode that I did a couple of years ago. They like the anti-humans, they just sort of, they really give me a lot of leeway and room to work. And they give me a lot of time and trust to, even when I go into areas that are a little uncomfortable, they sort of trust that I'm coming at the topic in a, with a good heart, and that I'm trying to understand the people involved, and they give me a lot of room to like get to my point, you know what I mean? To like develop a point and like, and that is something that is in short supply, these days, that kind of generosity, from people in terms of how they hear you. And so to have like, a group of listeners that are, you got to be pretty dedicated to be a Martyr Made listener. It's just like, I've got an episode, one of the Jonestown episodes, like 7.5 hours long. And that's 1 out of 7 episodes, and like,
did you record that in one sitting?
I think that one I probably did in 2 sittings, but otherwise, yeah, like my earliest episodes, and you can really kind of tell, like I would, cause I never done it before, and I was sort of, especially when I listen to it now, it's like a very obvious sort of imitation of Dan Carlin, just because that's, that was what was in my mind wanting to make it as far as my style. And so, I would, in those, like the first episode 2 or 3, I would record sometimes in like 15 seconds at a time, because if I didn't get the inflection just right of this sentence, or say it just the way I wanted, so that then I would just do it again. It would just be, the audio editing software was just like 80 tracks of just craziness. And so, but then, somebody had made I can't remember who it was, but somebody made a comment to me about like, that you don't really have to do it like that. And I decided to just try it with one of the episodes. Like, you know what, it's a 4-hour episode. I'm just going to sit down and do it. And so I did. And there were some ums and ahs and pauses and whatever. But everybody loved it. And in fact, I think certainly since then, since I started doing that, people like it way more.
Yeah.
There's a certain level of knows and uhs and ums that can take away from it for sure. But as long as it's not outside the bounds of what people are used to listening to in their daily life. Like people are, it almost, I think in a way it almost puts people at ease and lets them listen a little bit more. Like I know people who can't listen to audiobooks, but can listen to podcasts like mine. And
that's basically me.
Yeah.
The audiobook just sounds too rigid, like too produced.
Yeah.
Like literally reading out of a page.
Yeah. And it's the problem with a lot of the history podcasts that are out there, some of which are very clever and well done in terms of their research and everything. But it's like, man, like I can only listen to this guy read to me for so long,
Right. It literally puts me to sleep, in a sense. Like, how did you have any sense of like how you know you'll have achieved what you set out to do with this project, a sense of success and measuring it? Is it just getting, letters from people like with the Israel-Palestine episode where they say, Darryl, you've opened up my eyes to a different perspective? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's always nice. I mean, the way I like my favorite emails that I get, and I've got a bunch of these. I mean, maybe, I don't know. The one from the Israeli soldier in the West Bank was nice. The one from this Palestinian girl in the West Bank that I think I read to you guys.
I remember this one. Yeah.
That was nice. And hard to compare, like, what I'm about to say to those. But I'll get emails from people sometimes who will tell me that, like, they were never interested in history. They were never really interested in any kind of, they weren't one of the smart kids, that was being interested in history or whatever else. That's something that like the smart kids did. And he's not that guy. I'm the kid who sat in the back of class or whatever. And maybe I played sports or worked on cars, but like I wasn't one of the smart kids. Mm-hmm. And that listening to the podcast got him just by telling them a story in an engaging way, got him interested enough to want to read a little more about this. And they go and they say, that was like 2 years ago. Look, here's my bookshelf. And I read all these books. And now I'm obsessed with all this stuff. And one of the things that they will tell me is that, that process, it didn't just sort of get them interested in history, is it changed the way they thought about themselves. Because what you find so often, is if you have like you go find like, one of the kids in school who's not one of the smart kids, right? And you figure out what he's interested in. Maybe he's super into cars or whatever. And you get him talking about that. And you're like, oh, this dude's really smart.
Yeah.
He's just never had anybody that has been able to actually get him engaged on these topics. You get him something he's engaged on, it's like he starts talking about breaking down like a Honda Civic engine. He's got a 200 IQ or something, and memory recall of like an elephant. And like that happens all the time, And so getting people engaged and telling a story to them in a way that involves them in a way, in the sense of like, all of most history can be told in a way that makes it relevant to the people who are hearing the story, in the sense like directly relevant to not as if they're going to take lessons from it or something, but if you can see yourself in a story, or if it, if you're being asked to step outside your comfort zone in order to see yourself in the story, or just any of these things, to draw people in like that and tell them a story in a way that involves them, and then just to see people, kind of open up the way they think about themselves and the things that they're interested in, is, that's my favorite thing. Like when I get to a topic like this, I guess it's similar to the Israeli-Palestinian one in a way, where it's just such a polarizing issue and it's so hard to talk about in a way that's not going to offend somebody, especially now on this topic after my Tucker appearance. It's just going to be like, no matter what I say in this, there's like some people out there who are just going to interpret everything in the worst way. And if there are things that I say that don't fit their narrative, that's going to be me just sort of like trying to hide my power level or whatever. There's just nothing's going to, but for the people who are actually listening and people who come to listen later, that if they listen to it and say that, I told the story in an honest way without downplaying the magnitude of the atrocities that took place, while still treating these people like human beings, and in a way, victims of circumstance, the way we all are, right? In the sense of, look, I'm 43, right? When I was 20, I was a nerdy kid. I'd read books and stuff and whatever, but I really didn't start to think about the world in what I would consider an adult way, until maybe early 20s, right? So I'm 43. So that means 20 years of my life, I've been thinking part-time about these issues, when I'm not wondering what time jiu-jitsu practice starts, or I'm not thinking about what to have for dinner or whatever. So part-time for a very short period of years in the grand scheme of things have I been thinking about these things. And the idea that we can sort of wrap our arms around the world in a way that just lets us sort of in a Nietzschean, Superman way, sort of march forward as just pure agents of our own will, that is a total myth, man. We are flung into this world, and by the time we wake up and realize that I'm a grown man now and I have things to do and gotta, whatever, you've already got so much momentum built up behind you. So, just in your own life and your cultural life and the boundaries that are set up by your culture and your society, all these kind of things that are, in ways that, that ideally, they don't get so constraining that you no longer feel like you're acting out your own will, but that, the course of action the course that your life takes is to a large extent determined by chance, determined by, and I think maybe the reason I think this way, because I always have, even though it's not a conservative, technically, or a traditionally conservative way to think, it's all about personal responsibility and all that kind of thing. And if I was talking to my brother, who was, being, I don't know, brother, but if I was talking to my brother and he was whining about his life's no good because of his circumstance, I tell him to shut up and, take his life in his own. That's fine.
Right.
But looking at it more broadly, I grew up very poor, grew up in ghettos and barrios and just, around a lot of the sort of degradation that a society like ours drops out the bottom of it, right? And there are a lot of people I knew, so many people I knew, who were good people, when they were 14 or whatever, 13, 12, 15. They were good guys with good hearts who, whereas I had at this very critical point in my life where I maybe could have gone one of two directions, I had a football coach who just happened to take an interest in me and really kind of shepherded me through that transition period in the right direction. They didn't have that. They had their stepdad who was not a good influence in direct. There's so many things like that. And I look at my own life and realize that a lot of these people who fell off by the wayside, or in prison or they're dead or whatever it is, that it was a matter of extreme grace that I didn't end up that way. And it's a matter of pure luck, bad luck, that they didn't end up where I am. It was just as possible, if things had happened in just slightly different ways, I think back to just so many things that could have completely derailed my life and transformed me into a different kind of person than I am now, and I try to stay humble about that and realize that, always keep in the front of my mind that we all come into this world innocent, and nobody comes into the world seeking to be a bad person or to be a plague upon the rest of mankind or anything, So people are thrown into this thresher, and thrown into a world that, even in the best circumstances, if you're born rich in a stable society, at a golden age of time, you're still, you're going to watch your parents die. You're going to, you're going to suffer tragedies in your life that are unavoidable. You have to, reckon with your own death in the future, your own just sort of like physical and mental degradation through life. We have to go through all this, and, and it's not a lot of the, the social structures and ideologies and just other things that we construct as barriers between ourselves and the world, sort of filter it into something that we can manage and handle, are there for us. But sometimes those things get stripped away. And when those barriers get stripped away, I mean, you think about, like, if you get back to the topic a little bit, right after the First World War. So, like, the primary reason Germany lost that war is because it couldn't feed itself, and it couldn't feed its war machine with raw materials. The British blockade really, it was completely dependent on imports for so many things that they were able, through rationing and so forth, to get through for a couple of years. But by the time you get up to 1918, literally you have soldiers who are dropping from, hunger, exhaustion on the battlefield. And the people at home are, you're talking about, at the end of the war, people with the distended bellies and the sunken cheeks, like you're looking at a,
African kid on National Geographic or whatever. Yeah.
And they weren't quite on the, to the point of millions of people starving, but it was getting there. It was on the brink of it. The way this is, like, you read diaries of, like, literal, like, nobility, like princesses and stuff, who they can't get bread, they can't get eggs, they can't get anything. They're living on, like, cabbage soup with turnips in it, and that's what they eat twice a day, and that's all they got, right? Like literal nobility. And so the war ends November 1918, and the Allies decide to keep the blockade in place until the Versailles Treaty is signed, because the terms are pretty hardcore, and they don't think that the Germans will accept them unless they're forced to. And so for 8 more months after the war's over, they keep the blockade in place, and now people really do start dying. You're watching your children starve to death after the war's over, right? That's that's the kind of thing that, like, when I say, those comforting ideas and, sort of filters that we build around ourselves, between ourselves and, like, the real raw reality of the kind of world we live in, that's an example of when those things drop away and you're just confronted with, your child is starving right there. And not because there was an act of God that, destroyed the potato harvest, but because those people from that island right across the English Channel there won't let us have any food. Mm-hmm. And, to take something like that, have it happen to a whole society, and you take something like that and expect that you're going to go through that, especially on the heels of something like the First World War, and that people are going to sort of respond to that in a, the rational way that they would with full bellies, in a university quad discussing the topic or something. It's just totally unreasonable. People in history, like, we're reacting all the time, and half the time we're reacting to things that feel like legitimate crises, Mm-hmm. And that's, it's why so much of history is so hard to understand. It's because we're here sitting in a safe place where we, aren't worried about gunmen coming through the door over there and, finding something that's different between us and deciding which one of us gets marched off to be killed. Like, that's like fantasy movie stuff to us. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the stuff you read about in history, like the stuff that makes it into history books very often, are those type of times. Those are the times we're reading about a lot of times, And so, we have, you really have to try to put yourself in the perspective of somebody who's under that kind of pressure, in order to understand why they do what they do. And, I think that empathy is not synonymous with, or understanding is not synonymous with sympathy. People say, people worry about that. They think that, like, if, that if I understand these people as people, then that's going to lead to me sympathizing with them or what they did or excusing what they did. That can happen to a degree, but I think that, the example I gave about like the people I knew from my early years, my childhood, it's a good example. A lot of those people, they became bad people, and it's not that they weren't really bad people and the world just sort of, shunted them down this destructive path. No, they became bad people. They hurt people. They robbed people. They, did bad things. And there were people that later in life I would not allow around my family, but admitting that, saying that doesn't mean that I can't recognize the fact that at one point we started in the same place and we both had different encounters with the world, that in one case, overcame their ability to sort of, maintain their humanity and continue on as the type of person that they, when they were 14 and I knew them, like that they would have wanted to be, that they got dragged off that path by things that very easily could happen to me. And, I think it's important to remember that. And it's most important maybe to remember it about, the people who are like most demonized, because if you can do it there, then you can do it anywhere. And, whatever political or social consequences or anything that follow from that process, to me, I just think that they're outweighed by just the calling that we have to actually try to see people that way,
But it's interesting, even thinking back up, I mentioned the show earlier, another show, I didn't watch it because this is not stuff that I like to see, but it's interesting that, as you were talking about this, Netflix, I think last year too, they released this this whole show on what's his name, Jeffrey Dahmer, Dahmer, yeah, and from what I know about it, it was like a multi-episode series on like a deep look at his life and everything, like in full, Technicolor, HD, 4K, and so there are some stories in many ways darker and more personal than what happens to whole society between 1939 and 1944 or 1945, that we're still weirdly comfortable, like, let's kind of understand, but there's also this weird like voyeurism to it, but then you're like, well, what about this thing that happened 80 years ago? They're like, well, no, no, but this like insane psycho that's insanely dark, you want a whole series in HBO production. There's something kind of funny about that.
Yeah, the contrast is high. I talked to someone yesterday about, they went to Japan on a trip. They're like, oh, it was like, it's such a peaceful culture. Like, it was so placid. It's like, it didn't used to be that way always. But yeah, I mean, Japan, totally different. Like, we don't have like, again, like with the Nazi thing, we don't have like wars where, or movies where like Japanese are like slaughtered like they're the Nazis, even though they're on the same side. Like, it's a completely different world now.
I think one of the things that one of the reasons the World War II myth is so powerful is that, we have to justify to ourselves the things we did to win that war, which are not justifiable unless we were fighting like, just real monsters, like I know there's like if there was a pilot who flew a bomber that flattened a city, and he was my neighbor, or if there was like a soldier who went into a city with his men and just shot all those same people in the head, I could be neighbors with the pilot and I would not want to be neighbors with the other guy. So there is a difference in that sense,
right?
But it's not different to the people who are dying,
right?
And and so when you think about that, you think about the fact that like by the end of that war, we were running bombing raids on Germany and Japan that were, just undisguised terror bombing. We were trying to kill as many civilians as possible. And the message we were trying to send was, we are going to keep doing this until you surrender. How many of your wives and children and grandparents and so forth are you willing to sacrifice? Because we're going to keep slaughtering them like this until you stop, which is I mean, that's not how we fight wars. That's not, unless you're fighting the legions of hell. It's the only way you can justify something like that to yourself. So,
yeah, I mean, I think even there's a decent number of people who would say that the Nagasaki, Hiroshima bombs, who recognize the issues with that, but you've almost never heard of the fire bombings. Well, the fire bombings in Japan, but then also fire bombings in Germany.
I think I told you about this book last time we were together, but there's this interesting book called Under the Shadow, or In the Shadow of Hiroshima. I'll have to bring it to you next time we're together. But it's I forget all the exact historical details, but essentially the Smithsonian was going to, I think it was the 50th anniversary of the bombings. The Smithsonian was going to have this large exhibition on the whole thing, and then a couple of historians wanted to present wanted the event to be like, or the exhibition to be half like pro bombing documents and diaries and source materials, and then have at least the other half or some portion of it be meaningfully showing like that. Again, it's like just the historical context, like the dialogue around like this thing that did happen, but like what happened leading up to it. And the Smithsonian said absolutely no way. Or the government, there's this whole context where the federal government gets involved, and long story short, they end up saying no way. You're only allowed to display pro bombing materials, pro bombing. Every panel in the exhibition, as you're looking at the diaries, as you're looking at the fragments of this and that, it all has to lead to. It all has to be in this continuum of the narrative that we were always for the bombing. Everyone that mattered was for the bombing. The bombing was good. That's it.
Yeah, and I think, to go back to Tucker's appearance on Rogan when there was the big blow up when he talked about the nuclear bombings, I think the subtext there is that, like, in a vacuum, everybody, even Bill Kristol, will accept that you should not drop a bomb on a city full of women and children, right? When all the soldiers and men who are fighting age are all out at the front somewhere, right? In a vacuum, everybody kind of agrees with that, even the most bloodthirsty neocons. But in that particular war, if you, the thing is, like, doing that is only okay if you were facing something that is just a unprecedented existential demonic evil, right? Then, yeah, it's true, you're not normally supposed to do these things, but we had to do it there because of the nature of what it is we were fighting, right?
The Old Testament, like, wiped these,
and so
out.
By saying, like, starting to question, like, should we really have done that? Should we really have nuked those cities? Should we really have blown up Dresden and done all these things? By doing that, which, the subtext there is, were these people really so bad that we're justified in abandoning our humanity to that degree? Like, really? And, and I think that's the part people are very uncomfortable with, It's, it's, if we start to pull back, I mean, we're going to get into this in the podcast series. I did it a little bit in the prologue. I don't want to dwell too much on, like, the things that the German people suffered during the war. There's going to be a lot of that, but I don't want it to be like a podcast it's about that, which I think a lot of people, if they were to take this topic on from the approach I'm doing, it would kind of become that. Because, like, I think people would take the approach of, like, we all know what happened to the people that were at war with Germany. We know what happened to the Jews. We know what happened to all these people. Well, now I'm going to show you the other side of that. That's, to me, like, it's just, I don't know. It's not an interesting podcast to me.
What happened to the British after, like, through World War I and World War II, where if you went to Britain after the war versus even like Japan in the 80s or something, and you just said, who won World War II? You would have said, well, the Japanese obviously won, the British obviously lost, like, given the state of their economy, like their social spirit compared to what they had been before. Like, how did that transformation take place?
I mean, gosh, that's a complicated question for sure. I mean, one of the things I think that that came out of the Second World War, specifically the American domination of Western Europe, and the whole kind of cultural scene of the West after the Second World War, is that you took a country like the United States that was just by necessity, like we were a very open country. Like, if you are going to fill up a continent that's empty, or was before we got rid of the natives, and do that before chunks of it start getting colonized by other countries and people and everything else. If you're going to do that, you need a lot of people, and in order to get that many people, we had to welcome people in from all over Europe. We were bringing in, just the fact that we were a country that was just welcoming in Jews, Catholics, Protestants, atheists. You can all come over. Like, we weren't quite at the point where we were, willing to reach into the third world or the Muslim world and bring a ton of people over or anything, but still, for the time, incredibly radical. And as things did change, that same openness did get extended to all those other places where, that's just sort of, it's how we are now still to a large degree. And I think that sort of way of thinking about migration and cultural change and demographics and all these other things that I think you're getting at when you talk about Britain today. These are all things that in America, there's a very sort of direct line to understanding like how we got to think this way, because if we didn't, we probably wouldn't have conquered this continent. There's that level of openness was required in order to get people from all different places over here and then integrate them into into something common that could hold together. But then that that impulse, even in America now, has kind of like, run way past its, due date or its expiration date. But it also, I think, got exported to Western Europe and the countries that were under the influence of NATO and the United States, where, the same way, like, when people think of race in Europe now, that like, it was not really like when people said race back then, again, they were talking about like the British race, the Germanic race or whatever. The idea that it was just like, the
melanin content.
Yeah. Global South versus the white world. That's just like, was not the way that, it wasn't that people weren't capable of thinking that way. You have like colonial officials and stuff who would talk like that because they were in a context where it made sense, but in most of Europe, it just made no sense. And yet it got exported to Europe anyway, to the point where you've got Black Lives Matter and George Floyd protests all over Europe, after that happened. So, and so that gets, that sort of values regime that was maybe necessary for the United States to expand and grow into what it is, got exported into Europe. And I think it's only part of the explanation. But if you look at, the countries that were under the Eastern Bloc, and even East Germany versus West Germany, East Germany is much more conservative than West Germany. And the countries that were in the Eastern Bloc, some of them have, sort of global American empire approved leadership classes, but the people there are extremely conservative by our standards in terms of like just their willingness to say, no, this is our country and this is a Christian country. And, there's other people who live here and they should be treated well or whatever, but no, this is our country and we don't have any problems. Those are all Eastern Bloc countries. You can't say that in Western Europe, and, which is very interesting, right? Because, we're always taught that, communism was this internationalist movement that breaks down national boundaries and, just eviscerates national identity and stuff. And, I think that was true, very true in its early years, and it began to change later as like the Soviet Union really just became,
sort like close thing.
Yeah, more of a, it's gonna, probably not an exact way to say this, but really became like a national socialist project, where it really was that, not an international socialist project. And and so they were, the Iron Curtain kind of, crazy to kind of think of the Iron Curtain in these terms, but it kind of protected people from that particular germ, that came out of the United States. And that has rendered, all of Europe, not just Britain, but all of Europe, in Western Europe, basically unable to think of a reason why, like a morally acceptable reason, like morally acceptable to themselves. Like, people can't think of a morally acceptable reason that they should continue to exist as a people, and that their people should still have a spot of land on the planet that's theirs for them to work out their destiny in. They just, people have, it's to the point where if people start to have those thoughts themselves, they start to feel like dirty, like they're doing something wrong, and
Germany for Germans, bad. It seems crazy.
And what's really crazy too is, like, it's even infected places that have absolutely no historical. If you think of, like, Ireland didn't have any colonies. Ireland was a colony. Ireland was like the subject of imperialism. They weren't like the exporters of it or anything. They fought for years, like centuries, to maintain their little island and their identity and and everything. 30 years of liberalism, and like Ireland's on track now to be majority non-Irish by like 2070, 2060 or something, which is an insane thought. You would have told the British Empire back when they were trying to subjugate these little like ornery bastards, like, that this is what was going to happen. They're going to be like, no, what, like, did the Mongols come back? What happened?
Yeah,
like, no, they just decided to do it.
How much of recently, a lot of the stuff that's been in the news was in Europe, certainly in the UK, was having to do with all the resurgence of all the rape stuff across different English towns by overwhelmingly, I don't know if it was exclusively Pakistani, but certainly Muslim men over the last 20 years. And as we were preparing for this podcast and we've been chatting about load-bearing myths and other stuff, I was thinking, not just in terms of the UK, but broadly Europe, how, like, you talk about the purpose of myths. How much do you think the current input, sort of weakness, cowardice of Europe comes from swapping their one load-bearing myth, I'll say which one here in a minute, for another, the post-war one? Specifically, I was thinking of, I just read last year a couple of books on the Crusades, and more broadly the 14 centuries of Christendom versus essentially Islam, and all the battles and all the attempts, the fall of Constantinople, and the battles from like late 600s all the way to even the first like foreign enemy the U.S. fought was the pirates off the coast of it was off the coast of Spain, and that's 14 centuries of a story that Europe knew, and they were like, we have a beef with the Muslims. The Muslims are always against us because we're Christians, because they want to take over. And you have 14 centuries of that story, and then it gets swapped out with another narrative to the point that it was swapped, and this is sort of my theory, I'm curious about your thoughts, to the point where they're now so fixated on this new myth that the previous story of 14 centuries is so forgotten that they let the very enemy that they've been fighting for 14 centuries, the Muslims, keep trying to take over Christendom. Just let them right in for fun. Do you think that's part of what's happening? Is that an example of a load-bearing, of the consequence of one myth being forgotten, swapped out, reinstalled, reshuffled?
Yeah, it'd be hard to say it's not, because there's, again, myths shape the way people think about who they are and what their purpose is in the world, and I think for a lot of people in Europe, it's, in terms of the political class and the political structure of Europe, and maybe the type of people who read history books and talk about these things, that myth has, like, the World War II myth has it's sort of front and center in a lot of ways that for most people it's really not. Most people, I think, that they've really just had the old myth taken away, and they're kind of thrown out on their own resources, and that other one's floating out there, and they have it, they have it in them. But in terms of like what is really like determining their own behavior, I think it's that it really is like a loss of the collectivity, a loss of just any idea of us and why I should care. And that's a question I think that people of different times have gone through and had to answer in different ways. I mean, if you look at and when I say different times, I mean times where something has changed in the world that broadened or changed the way people's interacted with each other, right? So, like if you look at the times when Jews had like their strongest like nationalist uprisings, quote unquote, right? You go back to like the Maccabean Revolt, go to the Roman Wars, go up to the emergence of Zionism. Those are all 3 times, under Hellenization and the Roman Empire, and then Jewish emancipation and the opening up of like of European societies. Those are all times when, the level of interaction between peoples was at a heightened state. Where people were bumping into each other in ways they never had before. People were starting to assimilate with each other. And there were cross-cultural influences that were never really a thing before because people were more apart from one another. You have these times where something changes in the world, and now peoples are starting to mix and boundaries are becoming blurred, and people, they sense on some level that something's being lost, even if they don't exactly know what it is. They sense that like something's going on here. And very often that's when you get people pull back, like we got to do something or we're going to just go out of existence here. And, and I think today we're in one of those Hellenization type periods, right? On a grand scale like now. And, I think that the sort of paternalistic approach to colonialism that the European powers had taken by the time you got up to, getting closer to the 20th century, in the 1800s, where it had kind of become that, where they really did believe, like on some level, that white man's burden kind of version of the colonial story. That, one of the things that happens is, this is such an interesting thing to observe, because you see it in like World War I and II, for example, where, you use propaganda in order to accomplish certain things, to fight a war, or to justify colonialism or whatever it is. But then that propaganda, the effects of that propaganda outlive the thing itself, right? And so you go back, for example, to World War I, and, you find before the First World War, the British Empire had colonies, or places that the great British race has gone, and we're civilizing these places, and, bring light to the dark corners of the world and whatever. Throughout World War I, or backtrack a little bit, but there was no hiding the fact. It was like for the glory of the British Empire, right? And our glorious people. You go through World War I, and the people of Britain were subjected to 4 years of just incessant propaganda about how evil it is to go try to conquer other people's countries, and we got to go stop Germany from doing it. Okay, well, the war ends, and the people, they kind of believed you, even if they knew it was propaganda, they still kind of believed you. It's still in there. So that now you get after that, there's no new colonies being taken. There's the British mandate in Palestine. It's like has to be totally reframed and redone. And then after, obviously we all know like the whole system of colonialism did not last long after that. And so you see like, that is something that takes place where you see propaganda that's meant for a given purpose and maybe is necessary for a given purpose outlive itself and have unintended effects, What was your question though?
We were talking about what happens when you swap a myth for another. But yeah, that basically answers it. A question from somebody that loves your pod and has listened to the prologue. in the prologue, you read a letter from, I forget his name, but he was an American writing about. Was he an American writing about the Germans and just how the German race needs to be?
Yeah, it was a book.
It was a book.
Yeah.
Okay, it was a whole book.
Yeah.
Right. And just this sort of extremely, again, the rhetoric that we're used to either seeing and or imagining from the Germans towards the Jews, it's sort of reversed, and it's this Jewish American writing about the Germans in that way. So this other person was listening to this, and we were talking about it. Was there something particular in that time in history that made a lot of people just think about eugenics and think about, I mean, you have Margaret Sanger, you have different movements sort of at the same time. Everybody sort of, there seem to be these common starting points for how people are interacting with each other that seem novel compared to even 50 to 100 years before that. Is there something there? Like, why is everybody thinking in terms of eugenics and
there was a
sort of scientific approach to that world?
Yeah, that's just it. So they were living in a world where, like technology and science. I mean, it seemed to be like, the church could give you comfort when you're hungry. Technology gives you food. Science gives you like all of these. It allowed the Europeans to go out and basically conquer the world, because so the glory of your civilization, like the bread on your table, all of these things are being, if you have a technologist over here, or a scientist and a priest over there, and you have them like sort of discuss like who's contributing to this, to the way our lives have like been shaped over the last, 100 years in this glorious like golden age of our civilization, whatever. Nobody's going to be able to stand up to the scientist. I mean, they really had this like deep faith that like we had figured things out, that the rest of humanity throughout all of history, like they were just doing the best they could with what they had, and sort of getting by on superstitions and trying to, patchwork solutions to problems, and never really having the ability to just step back and look at the problem and be like, okay, wait, how do we solve this? Now we can. Now we have the scientific method. We have the ability to like, that the average person on the street like has a concept of like rationality, and can think in these ways and understand when they're being told them. And so people really thought like that we could do anything, like that all of the world's old problems were going to be solved. There wasn't going to be hunger. There wasn't, socialism and the Soviet Union in particular, the reason that it had so much support among like American liberals and progressives is because it was like the extreme version of that. It was this society that said like, okay, no more kings, no more like, seeing which politician can fire up the mob the best and like, get elected or whatever. No. This is ridiculous. This is the 20th century. We're all smart people now. We've got the scientific method. We can get the smartest people in the country and we can have them sit down at a table and they can figure out the solution to whatever problem we got. Like that's obviously the best way to do it. And they really had faith in that. That wasn't like a fig leaf to cover like just, the tyranny of the Soviet Union. They believed that, and eugenics was part of that same movement. There's a reason the same people believed in all of these different things, and there's there was an element of like social Darwinism to it, which is, doesn't have like a lot of like scientific basis, but, it's more of a way that you think about society and the world, and it shaped how a lot of people saw things back then, that like the health of the entire society was what really mattered. And, if we, it's going to cause some suffering by cutting out the tumors in our society. It's going to cause some suffering to those tumors. But, to the greatest number, it's going to be a lot better for everybody. And in fact, if we don't do that, then society is going to degrade to a point where everybody's going to suffer and everybody's going to, the cancer is going to spread. And so, there was theory behind it. And in a society where, people, where like the the high status thing was to have total faith in like science and technology and what could be accomplished. The people, embraced. I mean, a lot of the eugenics ideas that were put into practice in Germany, I mean, most of them really were all created and promoted in the United States and Great Britain. And, it's, people will say, well, okay, fine. We were just thinking about it and they did it. And it's like, well, we did some of it, for a little while there, we were sterilizing, people with, mental handicaps. Like there were, some deplorable episodes back there. Granted, we didn't do it at scale, but at the same time, it's like, I don't know if that necessarily, makes it, I don't know. I mean, I guess like the one that actually puts your ideas into practice is worse, I guess. But like at the same time, it's like the people who were writing those ideas in the United States would have put them into practice if they could. They just weren't a political majority. You know what I mean? Like they weren't going to be able to convince like rural Midwesterners to go along with something like that. So it's never going to be policy. But the people who were formulating these ideas would have done it if they could. And so, I think the world wars were really like the, they created this, they sort of did away with the faith that we were headed forever, like onward and upward to a utopian future, which is like, again, that was like the way that high status people were expected to think about the world, and they did think about it. The world wars kind of put a stop to that, but at the same time, like, especially in the United States, like we looked at the nuclear bomb and just the technology that really helped us win that war and created like a real, like we maintain that faith in technology in the United States. And I think that over time, even that started to fade. We're probably in a new era now, because you're starting to see this now with AI and other like software technologies that are coming along, that old like whisper from certain corners saying, I know we kind of all decided together after the last try that, these problems are probably just a part of the human condition and whatever, but I don't know. Now we've got another tool that I think it's different. And, it's rarely different this time, but yeah, I mean, that's what it was. I mean, they really thought that they were engaged in progress, like when, you think of something like German eugenics programs, everybody thinks of that in terms of all the other things that the National Socialists were doing, right? It's just, we're the master race and we can't have these filthy, disgusting like elements within our race polluting our blood and, whatever. And like, when in reality, it was like less of a recoiling sort of revulsion for these things than it was like of people really seeing themselves as like being on the cutting edge, and pushing into the progressive future. And, it's been observed by a lot more people than me, that like people who truly believe that in the righteousness of their cause can very often, do things that are far worse than people who are just committing crimes,
Sure. Yeah. So you mentioned maybe 2 years to get the series done.
Well, I've got it planned right now for either 7 or 8 episodes.
Yeah.
I put out episodes once I get into the groove on a series every 3 to 4 months, and if I can keep that pace, then yeah, it would be about 2 years. On my what I use my Substack for, this actually goes to a question you were asking earlier, is I sort of use that now as my dream journal as I'm going through all these things. And so as I'm writing out all my thoughts on the topic at hand, maybe there's stuff in there as I'm going down some rabbit hole that's never going to make it into the final product, because I'll read whole books that are never going to show up. Like nothing from that book is going to show up in the podcast directly. It just sort of helps me understand something better, but on the Substack, I'll write about that stuff, the things that don't make it in and side issues that people who are more interested in getting into the nitty gritty can follow. And so I use it for that. But yeah, next 2 years of my life probably are just going to be buried in, You know, like when I was doing the Jonestown series for about 3 months, I walked around with my headphones, just listening to Jim Jones give sermons and speeches and screaming at people and going crazy.
Like declassified tapes or whatever. Is that? Yeah.
And lately, like I've been, my wife picked up my phone as I was going to bed the other day, and she looked at it and she looked over at me. She's like, "You sure you want to go to sleep to this?" Because I was listening to a translated speech of Hitler's, and you got to do it. You know, you got to go through that, and that's going to be my life for the next 2 years. So,
yeah, awesome. So where can people listen to the series? I know in the past you've released some under Substack paywall, some in Spotify. What's your plan for release, and where can people find it?
It'll be everywhere you get podcasts. Yeah, the long history podcasts, those aren't behind any paywall or anything. I put them out on iTunes and Spotify and whatever else you use. And then, if you subscribe to the Substack, then there's a lot more stuff on there. You know, a lot of interviews and discussions and essays and, things like that. So
super worth it. So good stuff, man. Thanks for coming on. Good to see you.
You too.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Founding Podcast. New Founding has become a rallying point for founders and investors who are taking serious bets in the face of a stagnant business culture. Our venture fund backs founders building dynamic companies, powered by American ideals and a positive national vision. These are the kinds of founders that embody the optimism and competence of the people who come on this podcast. If you're interested in investing in our fund, check out newfounding.com/venture fund and follow the link to apply.